They became homeless, they lost their families.
The Prime Minister says he'll leave no stone unturned trying to improve the mental health of Australians. Every MP and senator is being asked to sign a pledge to do all they can in the next Parliament to stop Australia's rising rate of suicide. It's now more than double the annual road toll. A group of mental health experts and families of those who've taken their own lives launched a campaign today in Canberra to highlight the inadequacies of a system they say is failing to address an emergency. Here's political correspondent Sabra Lane.
Okay, well, what a beautiful morning.
The federal seat of Corangamite is home to the Great Ocean Road, one of the world's most scenic coastal drives. The electorate also harbours a dark secret.
There is no doubt that mental health or mental illness has an enormous cost on our community.
According to a new analysis released today, the federal marginal electorate has one of the highest suicide rates in the country.
It's a huge challenge, but I can assure you my government is keenly aware of the issue of suicide and the issue of mental health overall. Look, this is a very heartfelt issue. I can assure you it's a tough issue. We will leave no stone unturned in our efforts to improve, protect and advance the mental health of Australia, the mental wealth of Australia.
For the Prime Minister, it is personal.
You may not be aware, but my electorate of Wentworth includes the Gap at Watson's Bay, which is the place in Australia, regrettably, where more people take their lives than anywhere else.
Today, a passionate plea as mental health experts converged on Parliament House to warn that millions of dollars of taxpayers' money have been spent on prevention policies that aren't working.
Medicare has been a great system, but the simplistic fee-for-service does not work in this area.
Among the group, family members who've lost loved ones to suicide, some who've even saved children who've tried to end their lives.
I hear often that suicide has this ripple effect, that it just goes, this little ripple for the rest of your life. Again, it's a fallacy. It's not a ripple, it's a tsunami. 7:30
met Carrie Kepper last year as she was grieving for her son, Chris.
No one blames themselves because, like they say, depression is a disease.
21-year-old Chris Ball recorded this video for his family shortly before he took his life in 2014.
I love you all. There was nothing you could have done.
Kerry Kepper's adding her voice to the campaign to get every MP in the next 45th Parliament to pledge to make a difference, to stop the suicide rate from rising. Some signed up today.
Because the thought of any other family going through what my family has been through and what my family continues to go through, and I dare say will forever, and not doing anything about it, I won't be able to sleep at night. This is what I have to do. And as probably crazy as it seems, Chris is right beside me going, "You've got this, Mum, go, do it."
Everywhere the Prime Minister goes now, and the opposition leader, they will be asked about this issue.
That is a massive problem for the youth. It's mental illness.
Bill Shorten was asked about it at a recent town hall forum. He says it is a priority for Labor and asked the audience for a show of hands if they'd known someone who tried to take their own lives.
Shit. That's amazing. I just got goosebumps then.
The numbers are staggering. Between 8 and 10 Australians die every day at their own hand. It's estimated another 180 try, nearly half of them end up in hospital. In the 10 years to 2014, there was a 22% increase in the suicide rate, and that's despite more money being spent on preventative measures. Data released today examines 28 federal seats around the nation showing the suicide rate compared with the road toll. In Corangamite, Canning and Longman, the number who end their lives easily eclipses those lost on the road. In each electorate, the report highlights that thousands of people are in a state of high or very high psychological distress. It's the first time data's been broken down to show the impact of suicide in individual electorates. Those in highest stress are often experiencing the end of the mining boom or manufacturing downturn.
We've seen this in North America and in Europe, where they failed to respond to actually what was happening in mining, manufacturing, other areas. We've seen suicide rates go up, particularly in men who've had limited high school education, who work in the trades, then lose their job or they lose their wife, they're under financial pressure. Suicide rates go through the roof.
Professor Hickey sits on the National Mental Health Commission, which viewed suicide prevention policies for the Abbott government. It recommended the collection of real-time data. It also recommended 12 pilot programs be set up around the nation, similar to the NDIS rollout, to test new methods of early intervention, including the use of smart technology to connect those at risk with specialists. The government's taken a different approach, using primary healthcare networks. It will announce the lead locations soon. The opposition's committed to the trials, but is yet to unveil its policy.
There's a genuine agreement in Australia that we should be reducing suicide by 50% over the next 10 years. The only way to get there is to focus on those regions with high rates and see significant reductions in those regions. So community by community, that can be achieved, but it requires investment. But it requires infrastructure, it requires monitoring, it requires real-time responses, and most of all, it requires leadership.
This can happen to anybody. It doesn't matter how much money you have, it doesn't matter your status in life, it doesn't matter what you do or don't have. Mental illness does not discriminate.
Sarah Lane with that report, and if that story has raised concerns for you, remember there is help available. You can call Lifeline on 131114 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 4636. A squabble over spending is dominating today's federal election campaign. The government says there's a huge black hole in Labor's election promises, initially putting it at $67 billion. But under pressure to explain the numbers, the figure was revised to somewhere between $32 billion and $67 billion. While the government's criticism of Labor's spending is a constant, figures in this year's budget show the coalition's spending is also at historic highs. A short time ago, the Treasurer Scott Morrison joined me from Canberra. Treasurer, thank you for coming in.
Thanks a lot, Lee. Good to be with you.
The past 3 years of coalition spending makes you one of the highest spending governments in decades. On average, your spending as a proportion of GDP is more than the previous Labor governments. Why do you keep persisting with the fantasy that it's Labor alone with the spending problem?
Well, a lot of the spending we're now engaged in, Lee, has been locked in over many years. I mean, particularly when you look at the National Disability Insurance Scheme. These were commitments that were made under previous governments and supported at a bipartisan level, and a lot of additional spending has been locked in. Now, our plan is to get that down to 25.2% as a share of the economy. That's what I outlined in the budget, and that's where we're heading. Our opponents in this election want to keep spending more.
25.2% is still pretty high spending.
I think it's still too high, Lee, and I've made that comment before. And it's important that we continue to control spending going forward. Sadly, Bill Shorten just wants to spend like there's no tomorrow.
You keep talking about Australia's need to live within its means. You're forecasting deficits of $85 billion over the next 4 years. How is that living within our means?
Well, within 4 years, we'll have the deficit down to $6 billion, 0.3% as a share of the economy. And the projections, and I stress they're only projections, have us the budget back in balance in 2021. Now, that's the trajectory we're on based on our commitments, both our revenue and on expenditure. The Labor Party, though, have a very different trajectory because they're spending more and they're taxing more.
Well, let's stick with your trajectory for the time being. Last week's pre-election economic and fiscal outlook says that the timetable you're talking about, the trajectory for the return to surplus, is very sensitive to underlying assumptions. I think in non-economic boffin speak, that's telling me dreaming.
No, what that means is that it's a sensitive economy that's out there, and the forecasts that are in the budget and were confirmed in the PFO statement, confirmed by the Secretary of Treasury, confirmed by the Secretary of the Ministry of Finance, they confirm those forecasts. Now, they're the forecasts they provided to me as Treasurer, and they're the forecasts that are in the budget. Now, it is a sensitive time, Lee, but I stress that in the MyEFO document at the end of last year, we revised down our projections on growth, and I still think we have very very modest expectations of growth and consistent with where the rest of the world is.
But to give you an idea of how tenuous those assumptions are and what they're pointing out in PIFO, the timetable for the return to surplus relies on revenue surging as a proportion of GDP to a ratio we've only seen twice in the past 40 years. That's the sort of luck you're relying on.
Well, no, what we're relying on is a growth returning to 3%. Now, we actually had a 3% growth rate last year. We had, one of the largest years of growth in employment, 300,000 last year, that we've seen since the Howard days. So we are seeing growth in our economy. The forecasts that we have are what is provided to us by Treasury, unaltered, and they've confirmed those in the PIFO document that are there, and they are well below what the long-run averages have been for growth. So that's where our figures are. If others have different views about what the growth forecasts are, and particularly if the opposition has a different view about what the growth forecasts are, well, obviously then they would also have to accommodate that into how they're projecting forward their expenses and their revenues.
The PIFO document, though, is also making clear that if Australia wants to achieve the 10-year budget projections, what is required, and I quote, is renewed vigour in encouraging and delivering structural reform across all parts of the economy. Is that code for you're not doing enough?
Well, what it's code for, I don't think it's code at all, Lee. It's saying that you can never rest on the job of ensuring that our economy is growing and doing the things that you need to do to ensure the economy is growing.
So are you saying, therefore, that you accept that you're not currently doing enough?
No, what I'm saying is we have a national plan for economic growth, and we've set it out in the budget. We're setting it out in this election, and that starts with our national innovation and science agenda. It's our defence industry plan supporting high-tech jobs for generations. It's the tax cuts for small and medium-sized businesses and hard-working middle-income families. It's the export trade agreement, some 19,000 specific opportunities. It is living within our means to ensure we have a budget where we can guarantee funding for roads and for schools and for hospitals, and it's ensuring we raise the revenue measures we need to by cracking down on multinational tax avoidance and better targeting our superannuation tax concessions.
Today you were claiming that there's a black hole in Labor's spending commitments. Let's just take one aspect of those numbers. You claim that one part of it is a $19 billion spend by Labor on foreign aid. The Shadow Foreign Minister, in fact, announced $800 million over 4 years. If you're prepared to exaggerate and mislead to that degree, how can we trust you on any other figures?
Well, I don't accept that characterisation. What they announced on the weekend was one element I can assume of their policy. Now, if Labor is saying...
No, why do you assume that?
Lee, if Labor is saying that they agree with 90% of the cuts that we've made to foreign aid as a government over the last few years and going forward, well, they should say that, but they have not said that. Now, if that's what Tanya Plibersek wants to say to her electors in Sydney, that they agree with the cuts that we've made to foreign aid, 90% of those cuts she agrees with, then that should be made plain.
But surely you can only base your projections on what they've announced, not what you assume they might announce.
But that's what she did announce. She said she was going to reverse the cuts that we made in the 14-15 MyEFO and the 15-16 budget.
Well, let me quote to you from your own Foreign Minister on our program last night. Julie Bishop said to me, Tanya Plibersek, having promised for the last 3 years billions of dollars in increased foreign aid, has made an announcement of a modest increase when the aid budget was increasing anyway. So it was a non-event.
No, well, we don't know what other commitments they're planning to make in this area. But
Julie Bishop says it was a non-event, what they've announced.
Well, Lee, what I'm saying is, and what we outlined today were a number of things. First of all, we said they had identified $16 billion in budget measures which can pay for things. Now, the first thing they've got to pay for is the $18 billion in measures that they have blocked or say they're opposing in the Senate now. That's $18 billion. That was in PIFO. So they're already $2 billion behind before they've started. On top of that, they have $30 billion in commitments they've made, of additional commitments of promises on spending and not proceeding with other coalition measures. That's $30 billion, including $8 billion they've announced in this election. And then there's this other area in which the one you've referred to is included. Now, that's $35 billion. Now,
that's your assumptions.
Well, that's based on statements that have been made by members of the opposition, and we're simply saying this to them, Lee. If they want to crab walk away from the things they've said earlier and they want to agree with the position which says that they agree with 90% of the foreign aid cuts we've made, if that's what the Labor Party is saying, fine.
So
we will adjust those numbers.
Shall I apply that standard to you guys as well and assume that states will be levying their own income tax? Because, of course, your own side has floated that too.
We ruled it out, Lee. We ruled it completely out, and the Labor Party have not ruled out what I've just said.
In a speech last week, the former Treasurer Peter Costello said regarding your $1.6 million cap on tax-free superannuation pension transfers that the government said, and I'm quoting him here, the government said 1.6 million was 4 times the age pension. This is on the assumption of a 5.5% return rate. That's what the government thinks you're going to get. Does it really think that? It's issuing bonds at 2%. So do you really think that?
The calculations are based on a 25-year average earning of 3% above inflation. So 25 years. We don't set these measures for the next